Hey everybody, we're going to start. We're just going to start with some introductions about who we are and what we're going to do today. So my name is Alex McClelland. I'm a student at Concordia University and a person living with HIV and a person who's interested in anarchism. So I'm here with my colleague and co-conspirators.
I think it's funny when you call me your colleague. Like a friend since the 90s. It's cute. My name is Zoe Dodd and I live in Toronto, so thank you for having us here. Thank you to Pervers Cité for accepting us to do this talk. And so yeah, I'm actually a frontline worker in the downtown east of Toronto, and I've been working in hepatitis C and HIV for over a decade. I actually helped to build a program that is for people who use drugs to access Hep C treatment and Hep C and HIV treatment and care and support. And mostly I spend my time facilitating groups. I'm also a member of the Toronto Harm Reduction Workers Union, which is a union of harm reduction workers who fight in solidarity to improve our working conditions. So thank you for having us here. We're pretty excited to do this. We spent, I guess, like the last 3 years kind of talking about this topic. We spent a lot of time talking to each other about all sorts of things. But actually it was after a conference, the AIDS conference in Vienna, where Alex and I were at, we just both happened to be there, where I think really we started to think about this stuff. Because we ended up trashing a Canadian booth and getting checked out, and then Alex was completely banned from the conference. He like fucked up his whole UN career. I think that's the thing. Good job, Alex. What are you gonna do after your PhD?
Thanks, Mom.
Okay, say thanks, Mom. Thanks, Mom. We're gonna get heckled, that's funny. Okay, this is really serious. Okay, so first I'd like to acknowledge that we are on treated and colonized land. To begin with, we would like to send a message of deep respect to the Mohawk Nation, whose traditional land we are on today. Those of us who are settlers in Canada have directly benefited from colonization and genocide of the Indigenous people of this land. To engage in resistance and solidarity against injustices inflicted on the Indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly work to engage in acts of decolonization. The gesture of respect and acknowledgement in and of itself does not remedy the many injustices of colonization, and it is a very, very, very small step in bringing awareness to where we are and how those of us who are non-Indigenous got here as settler colonizers.
Thank you, Zoe. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we're going to do today. We are here until 8 p.m. and then we have to leave for the evening events at the Ritz. And thank you to the Ritz for squeezing us in really last minute. And also thank you to Pervers for having us be part of the festival. We are live streaming this event, so everything up from here is going onto the internet and being recorded. We're going to have a question and answer period if you want to not, or just so you know it's being recorded, and we may repeat some of the questions back during the question and answer period so that people on the live stream can hear it. But if people are uncomfortable with live stream scenario, stay out of this area. Everyone knows that the bathrooms are over there if you need to. And we all come with different levels of knowledge about both anarchism and HIV and hepatitis C, and we really want this to be an open and honest and relaxed, chill discussion. So we're really into people asking questions, engaging with us providing like foundational definitions of things if that's needed. So please feel free to interject. We are going to be reading from a document that we've written that's available online from the Institute for Anarchist Studies. We initially got a very small grant from them to do this work and go on a writing retreat and talk about this stuff with each other. So also thank you to the Institute for Anarchist Studies for this. And we are going to talk for about 25 minutes and then we're going to have a dialogue afterwards. Oh, and I'm the one starting. So together we have a decade of experience in addressing hepatitis C and HIV as radicals, anarchists, activists, researchers, and frontline workers. Born out of frustration, optimism, and the desire to change things, our goal is to examine ways of thinking while intentionally engaging with an anarchist worldview. To see how those most impacted by hepatitis C and or HIV, as well as other conditions, could merge these ideas to put the actualization of health into their own hands. We are working on an ongoing writing project. This project has been developed collaboratively through a series of discussions with a wide range of radicals, activists, workers, anarchists, and people living with hepatitis C and HIV in Canada, some of whom are here in the room, and thank you so much for coming. We hope that through our writing and through ongoing dialogue and discussions, to suggest that an anarchist practice when analyzing current responses to HIV and hepatitis C. Specifically, we aim to examine the capitalist organization of healthcare, reactive forms of community-based politics, and interventions focused on homogenization and hierarchical intervention, or top-down projects of prescribed sameness and standardization. The capitalist organization of healthcare and the reactive position activists have been forced into has created a context in which the imaginations of many people involved in responses to HIV and hepatitis C have been limited to what is prescribed by funding bodies through disciplinary forms of knowledge or what is able to be marketized. Our work together aims to stretch the imaginations of HIV and Hep C responses beyond the current prevailing reality. We argue that we already have the tools in place to save lives and bring these diseases to an end, but instead society is organized in ways that allow for millions of people to continue to die. Our hope is that we can inspire people to create space where we can rethink how and why the current systems to respond to HIV and hepatitis C are organized the way they are. With this, we aim to reconsider models of collective organizing to address these diseases. We also want to take a minute to dedicate our ongoing work to all those who live with hepatitis C and HIV and those who have died as a result of purposeful state neglect, profit-driven corporations, austerity, bureaucratic red tape, war, ongoing colonization, white supremacy, institutional violence, patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, and punitive legal systems. So we have chosen to focus this article or our discussion on our ongoing writing project on HIV and hepatitis C because of our work and personal connections to these epidemics. In addition, HIV and hepatitis C share unique elements. Both are highly stigmatized diseases that disproportionately impact marginalized and state-neglected communities. And both have emerged under the regime of neoliberalism. And this project is very different from what people working in HIV and hepatitis C are talking about today, and we understand that our very engagement, this is primarily for folks in the HIV and hepatitis C worlds, but our very engagement with anarchism will render some people to think that this project is wacky or illegitimate or just totally out of left field, and that's totally okay. That's what we're trying to do. And just to be clear, we are not the first people to think of this. There was an anarchist component to New York City's ACTA, and there was once almost an anarchist takeover of Toronto's 8th Action Now. And both Zoe and mine work is situated primarily in Anglo-Canada, and so we don't know the histories in Montreal, but if people here know about anarchist organizing in relation to HIV and hepatitis C in Montreal, that'll be really cool to hear about in our discussion.
Thanks, Alex. In our discussion, we will use some anarchist ideas to specifically challenge HIV and Hep C interventions focused on homogenization and hierarchical intervention, or top-down projects of prescribed sameness. These projects of standardization are designed to displace local, traditional, and vernacular practices with hierarchical forms of organization. They often mobilize synoptic forms of surveillance that are aimed to help produce homogeneity as to make things rational for higher authority. We'll examine what we mean by this as we go on. But we can see examples of these processes in settler colonization, the entire project of the state, taxation, land ownership, urban planning, education, universal laws, and public health projects such as with HIV and Hep C seek and treat regimes. As a distinct form of capitalist political and social organization, neoliberalism came about in the mid-1970s and has been focused on cutting back social programs, on individualism, entrepreneurship, a reduction of the state, privatization, corporate and managerial rationality, and efficiency through competition. The managerial logic of neoliberalism has come to organize a capitalist system of healthcare that is deeply intertwined with profit-driven transnational corporations in which illness is now profitable. This means that the ways in which we are allowed to respond to HIV and hepatitis C are prescribed by top-down bureaucratized institutions with the aim of making or saving money. In this system, there have been massive biomedical advances, billions of dollars invested in biomedical research, the development of thousands of non-governmental organizations, specified multilateral and bilateral agencies, public-private partnerships, billion-dollar cause marketing campaigns, and multiple multi-million-dollar touring conferences to address the diseases. Using the managerial language and logic of the corporate sector, this global HIV and hepatitis C professionalized response can limit conceptualizations of what is possible, including framing how knowledge and meaning are produced. Where often positivist, measurable, quantifiable, and expert forms of knowledge are privileged to provide a professional image that is efficient and strategic within capitalism. For example, forms of social science research developed on HIV and hepatitis C often reveal what people already know on the ground. But instead, the results come to produce a kind of expert knowledge that, as a commodity, can be used by authorities to justify forms of hierarchical decision-making that lose sight of people's actual needs. This is the case with the current imperative to develop research evidence on the benefits of housing for people living with HIV and hepatitis C in a North American context. There is even an annual touring housing and HIV-focused conference. I know, it's a wild thing. At this event, various professionals present research, for example, on randomized controlled trials using forms of housing for active drug users, housing that is linked to care and also managed in close contact with the police as a method to reduce HIV infections. Here, a basic need, such as housing, becomes understood as a form of control that is used instrumentally to support public health goals. In this context, resources are diverted to expertise forms of research with the never-ending imperative for evidence when all that is actually needed is affordable housing. While there is no cure for HIV, since the mid-1990s, a range of drugs have been developed which can effectively block the virus from replicating and therefore keep HIV suppressed in the body. This results in people being able to live with the virus for the full extent of their natural lives while no longer being infectious to others. Taken in combination, these drugs have been massively effective at saving people's lives, but only for those who have access. Access to these medications is governed through a system that privileges pharmaceutical company patents and profit and results in further exacerbating existing wealth disparities around the world. People continue to die regularly due to lack of access to medications that are still out of reach to the nearly 15 million people who need them. For hepatitis C, new treatments have shown cure rates of 90 to 100% with limited side effects. Gilead Pharmaceuticals stands to earn $30 billion by 2020 from their new hepatitis C treatment. The drugs currently cost $1,000 per pill per day, for a course of treatment costing a total of $84,000. Yet the actual cost to manufacture the new pill is estimated to be less than $250 for the full course of treatment. This treatment and others now constitutes a cure for hepatitis C and could promise global hepatitis C eradication. While society now has the ability to effectively cure hepatitis C, it's very rare that we ever actually have anything that can cure anything. It's wild. This drug is wildly out of reach for most people due to the patenting system, cost barrier, and the capitalist profit imperative. Access to these treatments at this time is extremely limited, and people are dying without access to these life-saving drugs. So Gilead even recently came up with another formula for the drugs that actually, because Hep C covers, there's 6 genotypes of hepatitis C. The one drug that they plan to profit from is only for one of those genotypes. So that's where they would make the $30 billion. Their new pan-genotypic medication, instead of $1,000 a day, it is $795 a day for a course of treatment, which still makes it wildly out of reach to cure the 180 million people who are living with it today.
Thank you, Zoe. So, what is anarchism? So Zoe and I actually sat around in a room reading anarchist theory together 2 years ago. And we came up with some definitions for ourselves. So for the purpose of our work, anarchism is a form of theoretical and practical form of social organization grounded in the idea of cooperation between people without hierarchical forms of governance. Anarchism rests on the belief that people do not need coercive or prescriptive rules in place to ensure cooperation in society. To believe that we need coercive forces such as police, laws, bureaucrats, militaries, regimes, anarchists would argue is a limited and pessimistic understanding of what is possible in people. Rather, anarchism is about mutual respect, a do-no-harm approach, and employs the understanding that horizontal cooperation will bring relative and responsive means to address social problems. With this, there is also a trust in spontaneity and a tolerance for confusion, for difference, improvisation, and social learning. Thinking through an anarchist worldview requires that we question the drive to intervene in others' lives and calls on us to reflect on the power we hold in relation to others. When thinking through anarchist ways of doing things, our current drive to endlessly plan, research, provide evidence, etc., can easily get in the way. But generally, if people have questions of specific instances, what would happen here, what would happen there, how would we organize, the answer would always be local and come from communities in question without hierarchy and without outside interference and without outsiders trying to make profit off bodies and illnesses. There is no specific prescribed answers except that anarchism trusts that people will always innovate, and through cooperation we will help each other. What we propose is a process-oriented anarchist view, or anarchism through the integration of practice and theory. What this means is that addressing social problems must come through a dialectical relationship between concerned groups of people over time. As both an activist and anarchist project, we want to be very clear that we do not you do not need to be well-read on anarchist theory to view our work as relevant. Rather, we would like to highlight that there are many anarchist principles already alive in our daily lives and in our communities. This is true of responses to hepatitis C and HIV, where people strive and fight for equitable access to medical knowledge and life-saving medications, bodily autonomy, participation in decision-making, and ensuring interventions are informed by lived experience and grassroots knowledge, and emancipation from forms of oppression, and also the right and dignity and social justice for all people. Often those working in hepatitis C and HIV interventions are not aware that the goals we just stated are exactly what anarchists strive to achieve. So very simply, people in the HIV and hepatitis C response already enact anarchist theories without being aware that they are anarchist, or sometimes. So for our project, we wanted to examine what would be possible if we very consciously engaged with an anarchist worldview to think through how people who are most impacted by HIV and hepatitis C, as well as other conditions, can start thinking through how to put the actualization of health into their own hands. So we propose a number of pragmatic concepts, perspectives, and forms of bottom-up social organization that are tenets of an anarchist worldview. These are mutual aid and collectivity, and focusing on horizontal and local initiatives and worker autonomy. In some cases, anarchists anarchism has been equated with violence and destruction, which is interesting as it's completely the opposite of what anarchists intend to make possible, a world to free all people from violence, oppression, and forms of exploitation. A practical and grounded approach to anarchism ensures that we can be flexible, fluid, responsive, spontaneous, and resistant to the solely ideological. And ideology, for the purposes of our project, refers to what queer activist Gary Kinsman notes as forms of knowledge that attend to managing people's lives that are not grounded in the actual experiences and practices of those people. So we believe that theoretical forms of social organization that are not grounded in people's lives or lived realities have the potential to be dangerous, oppressive, and violent. And in our work, we're not aiming to be prescriptive about anarchism or a form of anarchism. And this is where anarchism differs from many other theories about how to organize society or respond to large-scale social crises. We are not about elaborating a form of prescriptive, ideological, or macro-theoretical form of social organization either. We rather resist the modernist project of proposing hyper-rational and universalizing forms of social organization that are rooted in a false paradigm of linear progress. Such ideological approaches to social and political organization are often concerned with the administration of things through forms of centralized top-down social planning. These systems often see one solution to social problems. Interventions that result from these initiatives can force a singular solution onto people in ways that can be disconnected from people's local knowledge or their daily lives. This singular vision of social planning is counter to an anarchist worldview, which is interested in decentralization, in heterogeneity, and a respect for local knowledge and specificities. And one could argue that in the context of HIV and hepatitis C, that epidemic management is only possible through top-down forms of surveillance, identification, containment, regulation, and control. The centralized management and standardization of information has helped us understand the scope of the epidemic and understand who is most impacted, etc. But if we look back in history, things have been quite different.
People have been utilizing the power of cooperation and mutual aid since the beginning of the AIDS and Hep C crises. Mutual aid is about that realization that humans are social and that individuals can self-actualize through support and connections to others. In the early days of the HIV epidemic, in a context of massive and systemic state neglect, people impacted and affected by HIV came together to help care for and support their own communities, helping people die with dignity in non-stigmatizing environments, pooling meds and distributing them to one another outside of official systems of access, establishing collective community clinics, and developing community prevention, support, and care organizations, distributing sterile equipment for injecting drugs even if it is illegal, breaking laws that barred access, hosting supervised consumption sites without official approval. Or today, when we refuse to document details about people in public health databases for fears of how data collection systems will result in managing their lives, fudging stats to satisfy funding requirements, these are forms of anarchism. Just 10 years ago, there were still a number of AIDS service organizations organized in non-hierarchical models formed around feminist principles of collectivity. These organizations were forced to change their structures, to conform to funder standards. And while we are constantly forced to monitor, evaluate, and provide evidence about why and how we do what we do, the massive change in how we organize and deliver interventions has not been examined in any way to see if having middle managers and executive directors makes responding to HIV and Hep C more effective for those on the ground. Another example is from one of the early Truvada treatment as prevention trials. So for people who are not familiar, people can take this drug called Truvada, it's known as PrEP, and there were early day trials which I'm going to talk about, but you hear a lot about PrEP, and it's to help reduce transmission of HIV for people who take it. So early Truvada treatment as prevention trials conducted on sex workers in Nigeria in the early 2000s were in a context with limited to no treatment access. It was rational for the women in the trial to keep all the meds for themselves. if they tested positive at a later date, or distribute them to family members who needed them for survival instead of prevention. The trial was discontinued as a result and deemed a failure by Gilead and USAID, but the women did what they needed to do for themselves and for their communities. There are many historical examples like this in the HIV and hepatitis C responses. Another inspirational example is the current response to the prohibitively expensive and exclusionary access to hepatitis C medication. In many places around the world, people who are unable to access government-funded hepatitis C treatment have come together online in chat forums and using social media to advise one another on how to legally access affordable forms of the medication directly from the generic drug manufacturers, or by traveling to countries where governments have negotiated for cheaper drug prices. In the spirit of HIV buyers clubs, virtual groups of so-called non-professionals, I'm in one of these groups, are providing health support to one another and are subverting oppressive state and corporate systems to get what they need. A course of treatment that can cost $94,000 can thus be accessed for about $1,000. And we see this approach to collectivity and mutual aid as central to mobilizing forms of anarchism for health. So I just want to give a big shout out to Greg Jeffries, who lives in Tasmania, started the Buyers Club for hepatitis C by telling people how to legally get the drugs, whether you fly to India and you get the generics, or whether you can get them sent to you directly. And there are groups of people who have been doing this and online and been supporting each other and finding doctors who are willing to just check to make sure that they've actually cleared. It's pretty inspirational that people are doing that. And lots of people have been getting cured that way. $1,000 is still a lot of money for a lot of people, though. So these examples are the active realization of the anarchist principle of mutual aid in daily life. People take what they need and support each other regardless of what a higher authority deems as appropriate, as that authority is often totally out of touch with the lived realities on the ground.
So some of these examples, such as people undermining surveillance systems or not including data collection about stuff, could be positioned as negative, especially if you're a middle management person. That's not what you're supposed to be doing in your job. But we are trained our whole lives that think that breaking rules and undermining systems of authority is wrong. But as we know as anarchists, any authority, unless justified, is inherently legitimate, and that burden of proof relies on the authority. The burden of proof is on the authority, and if that burden cannot be met, that authority in question should be dismantled. So let's chat a little bit about the idea of homogenization, or prescribed projects of sameness, which is also how we talked about it. If we look at settler colonization as a project of homogenization, we can see that the colonial nation state has systemically worked to brutally and violently erase local and customary practices and ways of life. Diverse languages were replaced by a common national language. Local laws and customary practices were replaced by a national universalizing legal system. Local land use practices and regional understandings of land ownership were taken away and replaced by a common system to allow for easier land transfer and taxation. And local practices and knowledge of healing and care were replaced by national and provincial healthcare systems and forms of top-down expertise, as well as local practices of sharing knowledge and teaching were replaced by national and provincial schooling systems. As we all know, this is what happened in the Canadian nation-building context, where through the systemic genocide of Indigenous people and diverse local ways of life, settler colonizers aimed to homogenize the population and either totally erase or bring under heightened governance deviations, so as to strengthen the rational organization of the liberal nation-state, thus opening up wider markets for the dispersion of capitalism and producing a moral and respectable white population, which was understood to help enable the development of a strong new nation. In this violent project of sameness, people who didn't fit into the mainstream categorizations were considered deviant and thus needed to be classified, regulated, normalized, controlled, surveilled, or destroyed. This is a project of This doesn't make sense here. This project of homogenization is also a key aspect of hepatitis C and HIV responses, as homogenization has been a major component of the grand modernist project of science itself, which since the Enlightenment has understood that the natural world and the human body can be made knowable, classifiable, and rational through the work of highly trained experts developing specialized forms of knowledge. In HIV and hepatitis C, interventions must always be scaled up, must be official, systematized, credentialized, regulated, and organized hierarchically. For example, as governed by the United Nations, every country is supposed to have a top-down strategy to frame how the response to HIV is organized, to prescribe programs of action onto diverse local communities, often without addressing or understanding the reality of those groups, or through initiating hierarchical systems of representation and participation, such as with what are called country coordinating mechanisms of the Global Fund. So if you're a country that receives Global Fund money, you have this coordinating mechanism which is accountable to the money, and it's made up of representatives who primarily speak English and who can follow the rules of that higher authority. In many instances, local cultures, vernacular practices, and community norms are seen as barriers or in opposition to official, effective, and rational HIV and hepatitis C responses. And thus, these must be intervened into and changed to make people's practices acceptable to universal norms. In our work to respond to the diseases, people living with HIV are identified, monitored, surveilled by higher authorities, and coerced into being neutralized via anti-HIV treatments, or they are incarcerated or quarantined in prisons, despite the effects of those pills on our bodies.
One of the biggest current trends in the HIV response, and possibly soon in the Hep C responses, are massively funded countrywide seek and treat interventions. The BC Center of Excellence on HIV and AIDS, I love that they called themselves that, it's so ridiculous, right? Initiated this program in British Columbia, Canada, in partnership with the medical establishment, government, and public health officials to test populations deemed at risk through mainly injection drug use who struggle living in poverty, many without housing in Vancouver's downtown east side, and immediately put those who are HIV positive on treatment so as to prevent future onward transmissions. This approach, as we know, is called treatment as prevention, and is driven by a form of hyper-valorization of expert paternalism and celebrity doctor hero worship, which there is a lot of. A doctor knows best ideology, which is forced onto people, communities, organizations, and now entire countries from an extra local plane of reason and science. As the new norm of intervention, people with HIV are put on treatment to reduce their viral load and thus make them less infectious to others. In the seek and treat I do a lot of this model. Seek and treat model, HIV testing fairs. That's how I really feel about it. Are held in public parks, and there is a financial incentive to get tested. Overall, this intervention views people with HIV as instruments in the response, vectors of disease who must be tested and treated with toxic medicines so as to protect the general public, rather than as people who should be able to make autonomous individual choices about their own health. People should be able to make the decision if and when they initiate treatment. Since going on anti-HIV drugs is a lifelong commitment, and some people do not need these pills right away. Also, one cannot forget the long-term impacts and side effects of being on these toxic pills. In these processes, the agency and autonomy of people living with HIV is undermined, understood as mere instruments in the HIV response to help further HIV prevention aims. As a top-down social planning initiative, the seek and treat type of intervention fails to address the lived realities of people who use drugs living in poverty. I mean, the whole concept is like, we're gonna stop transmission of HIV, and there have been other studies in other countries that has proven that this does not work, that it actually doesn't reduce. It's not a successful thing, but as we are just taking this cookie cutter idea from Vancouver, thanks to the glorious doctor of the BC Center of Excellence, and like taking it and putting it in other countries, and they're looking at putting this in Hep C as well. All of China's doing it. Like, it's fucked up, because then people get forced onto treatment, and it can look really disgusting. So, to wrap up, we do not believe that there is one solution to social problems such as Hep C and HIV, but rather, as Malatesta says, 1,000 different and changing solutions in the same way as social existence is different and varied in time and space. As needs and conditions change for people, so must the mechanisms to address how society will function and respond. Through ongoing dialogue, reflection, and critical engagement without hierarchy or top-down decision-making, an anarchist approach aims to ensure that people's needs are met directly and resources to address them are made available to everyone. Activism on Hep C and HIV is often focused on defensive struggles and on documenting the violent and negative impacts of the governments and state institutions. What? Don't interrupt me, Alex. Just kidding. Such as highlighting human rights abuses, bureaucratic barriers to treatment, access, and care, and punitive and regressive laws which criminalize drug users, sex workers, and people living with Hep C and or HIV. A vast majority of community organizing around Hep C and HIV revolves around making claims to the state, including claims for human rights, claims for funding, and entitlements for forms of citizenship. This results in activists and community groups spending an enormous amount of time working to address state and administrative and institutional, bureaucratic, and legal barriers imposed by higher authorities. Imagine if we didn't have that.
So Zoe said we were about to wrap up, but we're not quite going to wrap up because I'm going to ask all of you guys a series of questions.
So pay attention.
So in this context that Zoe described, social scientists clamor to develop projects aiming to document or reveal the latest ways in which key populations, which is a term used in HIV response to talk about sex workers, people who use drugs, queer and trans people, are marginalized, barred access to rights and forms of health and citizenship, so that we can develop evidence to help enable change. In this context, the newest disastrous conservative policy or intervention becomes the newest hot and sexy research topic for social scientists to dissect, consume, critique, and produce knowledge on. Often social science research developed on HIV and hepatitis C is based on what people already know on the ground, which results in producing an expert's forms of knowledge that are redundant of what people already know, of who are working on the front lines and have often known for many years. And as we mentioned earlier, a quick side note, we do not need any more research projects to tell us that housing will benefit people's health. What we need is housing. But due to the valorization of expert forms of knowledge, expert knowledge helps support and justifies forms of hierarchical decision-making, and so the cycle continues. So we hope we can all take a step back and imagine for a minute what our responses to health and to HIV and hepatitis C could look like if we did not have to constantly battle against a massive state apparatus to get access to the means for our survival. So think through how much of your work is about documenting barriers imposed through legal, bureaucratic, and administrative constructs. The war on drugs, harm reduction, treatment access, criminalization, citizenship status, wealth inequity. These are all issues related to hierarchical decision-making and the liberal nation state and the capitalist organization of society. So now imagine what we could get done if we didn't have those systems in place, if people were able to access what they needed without a higher authority. For people in the crowd or who are listening on the live stream who work in public health, healthcare, or in service delivery, I hope that we can think through about how much of your work is focused on behavior modification, no matter how subtle or benevolent seeming. How much of your work is focused on trying to intervene in other people's lives, and how much of your work is aimed at trying to coerce other people to do what you think is right, or the system of knowledge you work with thinks is right. I hope we can think through why we may feel justified in doing this type of work, or what the consequence of this way of working does to our social relations. And for those who are social scientists, I hope we can think through what our role is in these responses. Are we here to be applied technicians to support the endless imperative for expert evidence? Or are we here to help work to interrogate and provide deep philosophical reflection on how and why certain regimes of truth have come to render certain forms of social organization possible, while others are rendered impossible, too optimistic, or unrealistic? Lastly, we would like what would be possible, or we'd like to think through what would be possible if our society was not organized in ways that views people's bodies as a source of capital and where illness and disease are a revenue stream for businesses, institutions, and a range of other actors.
Thanks, you did good making me do that. I feel like the lighting and
You're feeling sleepy?
no, I'm good. I had coffee with lots of sugar. Also, I'm shy. But this next part, we do want to have like a dialogue. We want to have, this is what we're really excited about, is spending the next minutes, like 45 minutes, talking through what that would look like and being aspirational. I think, for those of us, for people who are living with HIV and Hep C, for those of us who are working in HIV and Hep C, for anyone who's like interested, health is essential. Survival is essential. So when we think about these things, I think we need to be talking aspirationally. I think like the system is set up so we're constantly critiquing it, but they don't want us to be thinking aspirationally. They don't want us to be thinking collectively of what we're doing or how we do that. I think about right now about like Greece and the crisis happening with refugees in Greece, and there's 200 centers that have been set up where people have squatted and are supporting refugees who are coming there, not relying on the state. So when we're thinking about this and talking about this, we want to frame this in like a dialogue of like what could be. So even if you're not familiar with HIV and Hep C and you're here, like I think it is imperative at this point that we begin or we continue to talk about what if, and thinking. That's why we look back at what historically has happened, because it's also really important to think about what people did. So if you have questions or you want to comment or add what you think what if, I started to dream what if, and I'm hoping other people do as well.
Do you want a microphone?
Can we give you the microphone?
Yeah.
We'll like get this off the stand. We know how to do that.
Thanks. That was really good. I loved it. And I think a lot of what you were talking about was around social science research. But sort of in the back of my mind the whole time, I'm also like, what about like hard science research, and like can we apply anarchist principles or like the principles that you're talking about to like biomedicine and not only to like the social aspects of it? So like in terms of drug, so like you're talking about Gilead, hate her, but
Why is it?
yeah, but I like rely on that medication daily to take every day, and like hope that there are further developments in the future along, that like are better on people's bodies, are less toxic, or like a cure, how, like it's hard to imagine a world in which that kind of hard science development and like pharmaceutical production is possible without like massive capitalist investment and like shareholders. And I'm hoping that you guys talked about this when you were locked in a room reading Anarchist theory, because I can imagine social science research much more easily than I can envision biomedicine. Yeah.
Okay. So
I thought I'd think about this a lot because I work in Hep C and over the last decade have just watched one person after another die. Hep C is actually like more people die of hepatitis C than HIV globally now, and yet we have a cure. And so when I'm thinking like aspirationally about Hep C and about pharma, it's like, why the fuck why do these industries own medication that is for our survival? That's the first question. And the second is, why does that not belong to us? And so when I think aspirationally about it, I think about how these should be public, they should be owned by us, the scientists should be working for us and with us, that all of the medication should be, 15 million people should not be going out without medication for HIV around the world. And the only reason why they go without is because of white supremacy and because of pharmaceutical greed. And I think it's important because for us to think about that. And if we think aspirationally, we could control how those things are developed and share how that's developed, share those resources, share those medications, not use countries as a dumping ground for medications that don't work anymore or that we know have the worst side effects, like what happens today. So I think research and development of drugs should be worker self-managed, it should be shared, the resources should be shared everywhere, and that you shouldn't have to be afraid. Like we look at the Thailand example of Abbott, where 2 years people went without any of the medications because Abbott was so pissed off and had the control and ability to remove those medications from Thailand and did not give a fuck if people died. They don't care. And so we rely on these institutions that do not care whether you live or die, but plan to make as much money as possible. And the Hep C response is a really interesting example because Gilead knows. They knew that people would be angry if they charged $85,000, and they thought about charging even more. But they were like, oh, activists will get really mad if we do it that much, but activists will do this and this and this. They know what people will do and how they respond. They do not care because they know they're still gonna make $30 billion by 2020. So when we think aspiration, it's like, let's remove the power and why does the pharmaceutical industry have control over whether people live or die? So I don't know if that helps you guys. But
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very basic, the beginning discussion,
Yeah.
and we are more aiming to pose questions for further work, and we hope that this will open up new avenues for other people to talk about this stuff. But there is people doing really critical work on the patent system, trying to think of different ways of organizing that, and
Yeah.
James Love from the New Knowledge Institute is one of those people in the UK that's really interesting, trying to come up with different systems that could help people innovate outside of a marketized capitalist system. And we didn't necessarily think of how to apply biomedical research into this discussion, but we thought it has been consistently coming up because it's the one that is most technocratic and the one that's most linked to capitalism. And someone mentioned to me after our last one, they were like, I can't wait till I can 3D print my medication from home in the future and just bypass this all once it's leaked onto the internet, which is a potential.
That's pretty sick.
Any other questions or comments or discussions?
Oh yeah, it doesn't go much
It's
further.
just, okay. Can you say a word about India and pharmaceutical patents and what's happening over there and how it came to be that way?
Sure. So, India basically just the way that their system is, or their country, India doesn't acknowledge the patent system, or they just completely bypass it. So they have like a giant generic drug market there as a result, and they produce a lot of generics which are able to be released to countries. So for example, Zoe mentioned Thailand. So in 2007, there's the World Trade Organization, and they have this declaration which recognizes the patent system, but allows countries to bypass or buying patented drugs if there is a massive epidemic such as HIV. And so in developing countries, you can bypass that and get a compulsory license to buy a generic medication version of an existing patented drug. And so India is one of the main producers of that because they just don't acknowledge patents. So that what they do is they find the molecules of existing patented drugs and they make them really cheap, and then they sell them to developing countries through compulsory licenses through this World Trade Organization mechanism. And just an interesting example is when Thailand enacted that, so they were following international law, Abbott Pharmaceuticals, who were producing this one medication, which is a protease inhibitor, which was the only medication at the time called Calitra that worked in that climate, in a hot climate. All of them used to have to be refrigerated, so they were really terrible for low-income countries where there was people who didn't have access to electricity. So anyways, Palitro was, Thailand tried to get a compulsory license to make a generic version of Palitro or buy it from India. And Abbott Pharmaceuticals just said, fine, we refuse to sell 7 other medications and that one to the Thai market at all. We'll just remove ourselves from the Thai market altogether because they're just like, we make more money other places anyways. And so they were like, if you're boycotting us, we'll boycott you, even though the Thai government was following international law, which those pharmaceutical companies didn't agree with. So basically all these people living with HIV were then put at risk, and that those drugs were removed from the market for over 4 years. But I don't know if I really answered your question, but all that to say that India is a very large producer of generic medications. They still are. I don't know what's currently happening there in relation to that. But maybe other people in the crowd know.
Yeah, and I think that the U.S. has been intervening in what's happening in India around Hep C patents, and this is like really essential and upsetting because if it wasn't for the generic producers, if India wasn't such a big generic producer, then these essential medicines wouldn't be in like lots of places. So especially like Southeast Asia and like it's very essential what India does. And so there's been some really messed up stuff that's been going on that's like very underground that's happening around the generic production of Hep C. And these are old. This is like old compounds. It's not like these are new. And so here in Canada for like Hep C generics, it will take 8 years before there would be because our patenting laws, it's 8 years for a generic to come out. So by that time, I mean, it's going to be new medication. So.
Right. So the argument with that patent law is always courting the corporation. That if we don't allow them 8 years to completely gouge people who can't possibly afford it at, in Canada, where the government foots the bill for most people, if. I'm wondering if we look back, because your point about HIV emerging simultaneously to neoliberalism actually remarkably hadn't occurred to me. And I'm wondering, as a communist and not an anarchist, where in the 20th century do you think the idea of completely state-controlled pharmaceutical production, do you think we gave that up? Like, was that like a Red Scare 50s thing? There must be some, I'm just curious historically, where was the point where all of a sudden all government, it just became a completely corporate endeavor? Because there is a history of government-controlled, government-sponsored control of prohibited or chemical or medical substances. And so I'm wondering, because from Ian's question, it occurs to me that if this is the thing over which we feel we have the least control, then it's because government has abdicated that control.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's totally right. I think like in the early days of like production of pharmaceuticals, that a lot of them were done in institutes like universities, and there wasn't this like profit imperative like there is today. You could see the rise of the patenting and the property rights with the rise of trade agreements. So thinking back to NAFTA, which is really important. As a kid, I like helped organize protesting against NAFTA. I was like 8 or 9 years old. It's cute, right? But those trade agreements there's so many trade agreements. There's like the TRIPS agreement, and then there's like the new agreements that are coming out now. But those have really given like pharmaceutical industry lobbies, they've been lobbying for the newest trade agreement 50 times more than any other industry because they have the most to gain. And I think that we do need to look historically at the rise of trade agreements, at the rise of like looking at how we alleviate poverty by investments and investing in countries. And this is just like, this is the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism in the 80s and the rise of that is important for us to know, and it is important for us to acknowledge. And that there were medications that were cheaper. Like if you look at insulin, insulin was developed through U of T, and there wasn't a profit imperative, and so that's why insulin isn't as expensive to produce and manufacture. Saying that, they always find a way. You look at like naloxone, which is the overdose, it's an opiate, it reverses opiate overdose. It was pennies, like it's been around since like the 90s or 80s, or before that actually, and it's like pennies to manufacture. And now that they're seeing that there's like this overdose crisis, the drug companies are now rising the costs of naloxone because they know that we need it and that there's more and more interest in having it and having it more accessible as we're watching more and more people overdose and die. So off of their pain medications too, right? So, you know, I think it's interesting. Gilead also makes like so many of these HIV meds and Hep C meds and PrEP, and you know, when you start thinking about it, you're like, ooh, they can profit off everything.
Yeah, when we were doing our research on this stuff, we were looking into what Gilead owns, and they actually own all the molecules and separately, which constitute the constitute the hepatitis C virus. So they actually own hepatitis C at the same time that they own the cure for hepatitis C, and that's shocking. Any other questions or comments or reflections?
Sorry for the French, I'm not able to talk as I want. Do you think that a big strike on the copyright and the patents and the cost of drug in the big pharma can help to remove some patent or to help in the way? And how we can self-manage the research and find money from the union and something else like can we do union-based medics and control all the way? And can we withdraw the receipt for the meds and control the production by the people, or like stay the reciprocal or meds and something? How can we help in the daily way to have a solidarity between the workers who are in the industry and the people who use it, and to break the hierarchy between the two?
That's a great question. I work in a community health center. I think about this a lot because I'm not in the notion of like we need to destroy everything. You know how like lots of people get very like, oh, we need to like dismantle this whole thing and just like destroy it all. Actually, there are so many things that exist in the everyday that are very helpful. And I work in a community health center that when they started, it was like community controlled, had a lot of input from the people who access the space. It's not like that as much as now that we've got more hierarchical and because of our funding bodies. But I often think about like where I work, being responsive to what's happening in the community and being a place that could be non-hierarchical. So this theory of John Holloway, which is working within, against, and beyond. I'm like a big fan of this idea that I work within it, I work against it, and I work beyond. And thinking about how, you know, here is a health center that helps people living with HIV, does treatment and support for people living with Hep C, that has needle exchange, that has primary care, and then has all these other holistic health programming. So you can go there, you can do Tai Chi, you can be in a food group, you can be in a community kitchen, you can be in a men's group. There's just like so much going on. And then we need to look at these kinds of systems and localize. Like things need to be local, they need to be coming from those communities. So I don't know if this is answering the question. But in my workplace, we have the Toronto Harm Reduction Workers Union. We already have a committee inside, a workplace committee, where we address like workers' issues. And I think we need more of that within our center, as well as we have like we have community advisories that have a lot of power and sway. So it would be nice if like more things were organized that way, and that could work too for the development of medications in labs that are worker controlled, where scientists are actively involved in being worker self-managed.
Oh, just quickly, when I was doing my master's degree in Toronto, I got a small grant from this interdisciplinary funding body that tried to bring community-based research people who were working on HIV together. It was through the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. And they also brought lab technicians and people who worked in labs working on HIV medications together with us. So we were in these rooms with these biomedical scientists. It was really interesting and weird. And there was this one woman who, it was World AIDS Day, and we were all meeting a few days before World AIDS Day, and she was working on drug resistance in liver, like she's using liver tissue and working on HIV drug resistance for this one specific HIV protease inhibitor. And she didn't even know that World AIDS Day was a thing or that it existed, and she'd never met someone living with HIV. So as soon as I disclosed to the group, she was like on me, and really, and it just like fascinated, like, oh my god, there's a human body attached to this piece of, there's a human body attached to this piece of tissue that I engage with on a daily basis in this laboratory. But yeah, I mean, I hope we can have more discussions about how to build the divide between those two worlds. Because there is a massive one. Ian had a question No. Our microphone doesn't go that far, so maybe you can move here, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
It's just like a piece of reflection, maybe a question about the fact that the state lost control of the whole pharmaceutical business. And when I look at the news that I read and all the information that I have, I also have the feeling that the state willingly decided to lose that control. For example, if we look at corporate sponsored research in academia and in university medical centers in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada, most of the time they are funded by private businesses, and there are contracts between the students who will work for them and those corporations, confidentiality clauses that will prevent them and forbid them from ever referencing what they do or giving any formal information that might allow corporate secrets to leak out, which is also a huge issue for the students who often have tried to be able to like do thesis or give conclusions to the work they did and could hardly do it. So like, in my sense, there is a very huge willingness from the state to take part in it and to support that kind of system. Also, I feel like there might be limits to the generic options that we have for the patent business and how to go around it. When that guy, I don't remember whose name it was, that fucker who tried to like gouge the prices of a medication that already existed. Yeah, that fucker. When he tried to gouge the prices of a medication that was quite affordable to a lot of people. The first thing that he did to make sure that generic businesses could not provide a generic for this, because they did not think about doing it before, was to completely close access to that medication. And I remember that the only response we were able to do as activists was try to basically dox him, so that people could harass him on a regular basis until he would give up. And I wonder if there were any form of activist responses to that, to similar situations. And the last thing about that project or study that was made in, was it in which country was it made? The one that was made in the early 2000s? Yeah.
Nigeria.
Okay, in Nigeria. A thing that I've been told when it comes to South African countries and other countries in the Caribbean and the Global South is that there is also often a cultural stigma surrounding the fact that people have certain forms of illnesses and like particular ones, which makes it harder for people to keep up with their treatment because and they need to hide it from families. And there's also the whole thing about the fact that most of the time resources are kept away by the state. So I just wondered what kind of cultural approach we could provide that would not sustain the imperial and colonialist kind of response that we usually give when we want to interact with the global south.
I mean, we don't have the questions for that, and those answers should come from the global south, which is what we're talking about in our work. And I think people, there's like cultural issues for people taking their medications here as well that cause issues. I mean, I know from a long time doing work with young people living with HIV, there was lots of issues about taking medication at school or publicly because they don't want to because you have to take medication on a regular basis and people don't want to disclose. There's lots of ways that is an issue in lots of different cultures, and we don't have the answers for that, and those are really important questions that you're raising and questions that I think should come, or answers that should come from those communities. I don't know, Zoe, you have something?
No, I agree. I think that's important.
And that's what we've been trying, like with this project, what we've been thinking about is like, this shouldn't be that the answers come from within those communities, and that they are like that they address the cultural norms of those communities. And I think that some of the cultural norms that have existed is because of the top-down bureaucratized way in which these like are thrust onto communities. I forget.
University research, banning of releasing of research by corporations.
Yeah, actually, it is, to speak to your other question, it is really the relation, I think that doctors and specialists and people involved in the responses need to be more open about where they get their funding from and who funds them to do what they do. So in hepatitis C response, 80% of the nurses that were treating Hep C in the province of Ontario, where I'm from, were funded through the pharmaceutical industry. Many of the researchers that speak and go to like conferences and doing the research are funded through the pharmaceutical industry. It is a challenge for them to not have bias, and no matter what they say, they have bias. They also have stocks, like lots of people have stocks and shares in the pharmaceutical industry, which they also don't disclose, but they do. And so I think that's important, those relationships. We have a reliance. The government, the state has put that reliance on that response. In Canada, we do not have a national strategy to address Hep C. We have very limited funding to address hepatitis C, and we have relied heavily on the pharmaceutical industry, who at the same time has like created this most expensive drug. But not just Hep C, not just HIV, but the response to cancers, the response to other health issues. It's becoming more and more of a problem, and that we do not have time to rely on anymore, as people are just like dying because of this profit imperative. The pharmaceutical industry knows. We really rely on pharmaceuticals for people's survival.
Any comments or questions?
Okay. Right now, the reason they have patents is so that they can have enough time to sell the drug and make a profit. But some of them can be 2 years, it can be 5, 10, 20 years that they're following a molecule to see if it's good or not, and that costs a lot of money. And I'm really not against patents for a short period of time. The problem is that everything starts in the US, and their policy is to charge as much as the customer can bear. So it's the maximum price to maximize the profits. And I think governments should step in. I mean, we as a community have been saying it for decades that they're charging way too much. But the governments have to step in and say, well, that's an unreasonable profit, because our voice is not going to count.
Right.
Governments won't do that. So if you look at Gilead, for instance, that's an American corporation. Americans pay the most money to access Hep C treatment. It's been negotiated all around the world. In Egypt, where 20% of the population are infected with Hep C, the cost of Hep C treatment is probably the lowest because of negotiations and the pricing. Our government does not care. They don't care. I think that's what we have to like just sit with, which is hard to acknowledge. But they do not care whether people live or die, and they don't care whether you get access or you don't. At the end of it, if they did care, they wouldn't have made these like kind of agreements that allow for like in Canada, it's like the drugs, they get approved, and then they go through province for province for province for negotiations, and they care more about the profits of those companies than they do about us. And I think that's what we need to remind ourselves as, is they don't care about the people as much as they should. And so that's what patent and property rights allow, is they allow for like control, and they don't care about whether you live or die. And that's what's so fucked up about it. And they don't care if you're a sex worker, you're a drug user, or you're First Nations, you're living in prison. Like, they really don't give a fuck about you, whether you survive or you don't. But we should care about each other. And so that's why, we want to have these dialogues, because we need to think about aspirationally. We need to be taking control of this. These drugs we shouldn't have patent and property rights, to be honest. I don't agree that we should.
One other thing, I think the myth, which is, there's also a myth that pharmaceutical companies like to keep alive, that research and development costs all of this money, but what they do is often buy molecules developed by publicly funded university institutions, and then they say they spend all this money on research and development when all they've done is gone and buy a molecule or something that's proven successful, that's already been publicly funded, and research and development has already been done.
With gouged prices.
With then gouged prices. So it's a myth. The R&D system, which backs up the idea of the patent system, is a myth.
The amount is a myth.
The amount
is a myth. Yeah.
It costs money.
It costs money in the system we live in.
Canada charges
right.
them, and FDA charges them. Every country.
But I think one of the things we want to challenge.
So what is your system to get these drugs
One
from
of-
molecules?
One of the things we want to, I know, it's great. One of the things we want to challenge is that people need a financial incentive to innovate and to make things to help other people's lives, to change other people's lives. And we disagree with that. We think that people would innovate if there was a different way to compensate people, regardless. Because there's always going to, there's people like we mentioned. We mentioned already, there's like patent experts like James Love at the New Knowledge Institute in the UK, who's developed a whole range of different systems to support R&D. Like there's like ones that are successful, you end up kind of like winning a lottery, or you get a one-time prize, a financial incentive for the individual, as opposed to a private corporation incentive. And if you're interested in those things, you can look him up.
If one individual creates a molecule.
You can look him up. You can look him up, research him. There's a whole bunch of other alternatives, and there's a huge amount of people working on those alternatives to the patent system. We have not specifically focused just on that stuff, but if you're interested in that, although you said you support the patent system, there are a whole bunch of alternatives.
Unless you have a better system.
Well, that's what we're proposing, is that we need to think of better systems. We want people to think beyond, because we are stuck in this thinking that this is just how it is. Well, this is not how it always has been, and nor is it going to last. And nor should we think that it has to be this way. We can't depend on the system. It's not working. For the millions of people that go without, the millions of people that are dying, we can't rely on the system, and we have it within ourselves to think about that. So, their argument for Gilead was oh, it cost them so much money for research and development. They never researched and developed the drug Harvoni. Another company did, and they made back, in the first week of sales of that drug, they made back how much it cost them to actually get that drug in the first place.
I think another big challenge is that we put everything at the ownership of the state level, and we're living in an age where trade policies like NAFTA and TTIP and CETA, which are the imminent policies of trade between Europe and Canada, where many pharmaceutical industries exist, allow for, even if we made changes to patent law, lawsuits in terms of corporations against states. So I think a lot of states don't want to act in the benefit of people who actually have to take medication, who pay extraordinary prices, or the systems that pay extraordinary prices because they're concerned about being sued by corporate entities that have become nation-state beneficiaries of these policies. But my question for the panel is, after AIDS 2016 in Durban, you see World Bank, going back to our macro level discussion, kind of using the same dialogue as the two of you in your critique to criticize the Durban conference, talking about the failure of 90-90-90 predictions for HIV by 2020, talking about the failure of treatment as prevention. What does it mean for a global financial entity like World Bank to wear the garment of the activist foil? What does that mean for discussions like this?
They wrote a response after AIDS 2016, and what they said was that we should fund more. So AIDS 2016 is one of the, for people who don't know, it's one of the giant HIV conferences, and this year there were a lot of celebrities at it, like Elton John, Queen Latifah, I really like. What? The U.S. Army?
Prince Harry.
But yeah, it's like a giant, if you've ever been, it's like, if you ever go, it's like a little bit depressing because you're like, there's so much fucking money here, and this could go to actually meds for people and other things that people need for their survival. But yes, the World Bank recently wrote a response about the conference, and it's interesting because the World Bank has completely gutted and destroyed so many countries financially and has impoverished and made countries really struggle and done it to them. And so at the same time they're making critique about how HIV and the transmission of it and people's lack of access around issues around poverty, and yet the World Bank has historically been involved in creating poverty. And so their response was finance, we need to keep up the financing of HIV. And so what's interesting about that is what financing? I would like to know what financing you're talking about. Which money are you talking about that needs to go? Because we do pour in money in certain areas where you're actually maybe that isn't where we should be putting the funding. I would like to know where all that funding goes. And I think we should think critically about that, but without reducing it, but think about it, because some of what people need is free the meds. It's medical apartheid is what's happening within the HIV response.
And just to go back quickly to what you were talking about, I think it's really important, or just to situate what we are trying to do and what our role is, or what we're interested in doing is we are interested in provoking people to think differently. And we haven't come up with all the solutions or other ways of thinking about things. We want to open up people's imaginations to do that. And there are hundreds of thousands of people working around the world to address hepatitis C and HIV who can all work to do that. And we want to help provoke people to think differently. And so you're an expert on this stuff. You've been doing this stuff for a long time. And you've probably thought of alternatives because you know that the patent system is failing people, and we've seen our friends die because they can't get access to medications around the world. So we have to do things differently.
But to get alternatives for the whole world and everybody to act the same.
Well, that's not what we're saying. I mean, we want local initiatives and people to work on things locally. But we only have a few more minutes. If anyone has a really pressing question or comment, please raise it. Okay.
So this is maybe a little bit broad.
So the cord's really short. Sorry.
So I guess just sort of think of me as a baby anarchist. And I'm wondering, in your reading of anarchist theory, maybe what tools for change, and maybe this sounds naive, but in the spirit of aspirational thinking, is there a to-do list? Is there what tools do you have to make positive picture?
Well, Zoe already mentioned this idea of thinking in, against, and beyond, which we like to promote. So we like to talk about how currently within systems, instead of tearing everything down and with a scorched earth anarchist policy where we have to start from scratch, where there's already systems in place that we can work to do what we need to do to survive. So people are working in frontline organizations and undermining oppressive systems to do what they need to do to survive. And getting the resources to people, whether they're diverting things or lying to higher authorities or whatever to do. And then we also just want people to think aspirationally, and also then against what we really need to get rid of, because there are a whole bunch of things that we do. So I think thinking about our work in those specific ways is a starting point. So what kind of things can we do to resist the current systems that are fucking us over? What kind of things do we need to get rid of? And then what is our aspirational goal? I think one of the things that we are interested in thinking about in this and having this kind of aspirational thinking, which seems a little like posy and hippy-dippy, but for us is really important because working in the HIV and hepatitis C responses, you're constantly put in a reactive position where you're only responding to putting out fires or daily emergencies, or respond in a reactive position to respond to whatever systems of oppression are put in place to organize what we're doing. And so we just wanted to think beyond that. So this is one of those steps to think beyond what is currently happening. And where it's only a small step in that direction, we hope that other people can take it forward more.
I like that. Yeah, and I think the continued dialogue and for us to keep doing this and to talking to each other and getting to know each other and building on that and let's not be afraid. I think part of what the state is, state knows that we are afraid, and I think we are afraid to be thinking aspirationally, to be talking about what if, what could be. We need to do that more, and we need to do it in ways that feel comfortable and not be so scared to do that. And I really like your question. And that is hard for us to think grassroots and bring it back locally. And if you work in a sector like I do, there are lots of things I do to resist the system with the people I'm working with, and I do that on the everyday. And that is an act which we cannot devalue. I think it's important, and I know that there's other people who do that too. And that sometimes can be very isolating because we know that we're working in a professionalized system where there aren't so many of us anymore. So we need to educate and agitate the people we're working with to really talk to them about those things as well, which I do every time a new worker comes on. You shouldn't write that much in your notes, and you shouldn't write that, and you shouldn't do this, but here's some suggestions which you could do. Really simple things that actually could make someone's life a lot easier. Oh, that thing that person told you, do not put that in your notes. That's very important that you put the most minimal or don't put it at all. So I think those acts of resistance we don't often talk about, but they're very valuable and needed. So
that's a really nice segue into the shameless promotion of our beautiful, anonymously written How to Have Sex in a Police State One Approach booklet that we have passed out to you. If you didn't get some, there are some up here. But this is a document written by people living with HIV in Montreal to look at countering HIV criminalization in Canada. So Canada is one of the biggest countries in the world, or a hotspot in relation to criminalizing HIV exposure and non-disclosure. There's currently around 190 people living in Canada who've been charged in relation to not disclosing their HIV status or for exposing other people to HIV. And they're charged with some of the highest criminal charges in the criminal code, most often aggravated sexual assault, which is kind of up there with first-degree murder. And anyhow, so a group of people put together this booklet on how to work against that system and how to encourage people not to call the police on each other, encourage organizations or people working in organizations not to document things on people that can be used against them in court, because what happens in a lot of these cases is that people's medical records or records from engagement with community organizations are then subpoenaed and used against them in a courtroom. And anyhow, so this document exists online on a Tumblr, but also here physically, so please grab some. And it's kind of an active realization of some of the stuff we've been talking about for one specific issue. It's in English and French, it's on both sides. It's for English, yes. So thank you everyone, grab a drink, and thank you for listening to this.